The COVID-19 pandemic has left a long-lasting impact on the most basic sectors of the economy, be it food, agriculture, health, and education. However, every crisis can be viewed as an opportunity, and the experience of the past few months has made it amply clear that these sectors and the numerous subsectors are experiencing change, in some ways for the better. In the post-COVID-19 world, these sectors are likely to emerge leaner and stronger, and perhaps now become COVID-19 bright spots. To shed more light on the subject, next we bring you a panel discussion that will be moderated by Bikramjit Ray, editor, ET Hospitality World. The speakers on this session include Ronnie Screwvala, chairman, upGrad; Marcel Smits, chairman, APAC and head corporate strategy, Cargill; Shantanu Mukherjee, chief policy and analysis branch at Division for Sustainable Development, UN-DESA; and Kamal Singhani, global business services head, IBM.
Welcome to a very special panel on Back to Basic at the ET Global Town Hall. I have some very eminent panelists with me, and we're going to talk about the three pillars of development among countries across the world, especially in the developing world. And those are education, health, and of course, agriculture. We've already had two very special sessions with Muhammad Yunus and Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, and now we're going to get into the meat of the matter. My panelists who are going to be joining me today are Ronnie Screwvala. He's the chairman and co-founder of upGrad. I have Marcel Smits, who's the chairman and Asia Pacific head for corporate strategy at Cargill. I have Shantanu Mukherjee, who's chief of policy and analysis branch at the Division for Sustainable Development at UN-DESA. And lastly, I have Kamal Singhani, who is the managing partner and country leader for IBM Global Business Services, India and South Asia. Thank you everyone for taking time out and joining me on this very interesting panel. So let me begin with Marcel, because we want to talk about agriculture, because agriculture is the big elephant in the room, and it's something that forms a huge basis in most developing countries. So Marcel, can you start by telling us a little bit about how we can, and because the theme of this panel is basically how with COVID, a lot of things are being recalibrated. So how do you think we can do agriculture better?
You know, COVID was a very big, impactful event, of course, for the world of agriculture, as it's been everywhere else. In Cargill, the initial impact was very much focused on how do we make sure that we keep food supply chains going. I think that the whole crisis has been shining a light on the importance of food supply chains. In Cargill, we're very focused on safety. So giving people our marching orders of make sure that everybody is safe, but at the same time make sure that food supply chains keep going, have helped us a lot in the early days of the crisis. In the early days of the crisis around the world, we've seen lots of disruption as countries went into lockdown. Typically those disruptions would take a week or two. And then governments and you know, both at federal and at state or provincial levels would sort things out and things would flow again. Overall, the food sector has held up remarkably well, but it's pretty clear that there are some big changes afoot. As we now do our strategy evaluation, we see an enormous amount of push behind digitalization. E-commerce platforms, be they B2C or B2B, are exploding. So the growth of digital enablement is going very, very rapidly. And that's actually pretty exciting. So in Cargill, we are running, for example, sales conferences. In the past, we would have an assumption that we'd have to have people out there to talk to farmers individually, driving around countries in cars and on motorbikes. And we're actually learning that we can reach enormous amounts of people, thousands of producers with digital means. So that's an exciting development, digitalization. The second one that I would say is, I've already touched on that, is focus on food supply chains security or food security. And there's going to be lots of governments who, you know, when this is all said and done, are going to say, well, you know, how dependent are we really from foreign sources? And I think they'll recalibrate a little bit. The third thing that we're seeing is a lot more focus on sustainability. When we went into the crisis, I think there was some notion that people said, well, we're going to go into an economic downturn, and in an economic downturn, consumers tend to care less about sustainability attributes of food supply chains, and we're actually seeing the opposite. So in our strategic planning, we're very much working towards the assumption that that's what we're going to be focused on even more than we have in the past.
Ronnie, I know education is such an important part of the Indian ethos and also in most of Asia. And one of the things about education which everyone complains about is the lack of quality education and how we can get to it. So what are you doing in this field which will make a difference going forward?
Yeah, and just before that, thank you very much. But before that, I just want to add to Marcel's point. Because we work in our rural foundation of the Swadesh Fund in rural India. I think one of the changing points, even in agriculture, in this last 4 or 5 months, has really been the element of a sense of because reverse migration has taken such a huge form in India. Actually, the people who've been a little bit more evolved and a little bit more knowledgeable in the big cities that have come back to the villages. They've actually been able to precipitate and give the gumption, explain financial inclusion, increase awareness, that they want to look at this as an option for them. So I think we'll see a fair amount of spurt in rural India, at least, when it comes to things like agriculture. To move to your question specifically on education, I think the last 4 months, what we've been trying to do in education for the last 4 years, what I would have taken another 4 years to do, I think we'll do in the next 18 months. So I think the element of the pandemic has brought a sense of focus, a sense of urgency to the entire space of education. Now, for most people, it just sounds like a temporary field that since no universities and colleges anywhere in the world or schools are working, you put a camera in front and the lecturer now substitutes his lecture in the classroom. But that's not online education. So I think part of the thing we're very evangelizing is the fact that deep learning experience is going to be a very important one. So 3 aspects. When you're looking at the college and the undergrad, I think the question of online learning, the acceptability from universities, the acceptability from the corporate world, is becoming very urgent and very large. When you're looking at the working professional, there's a penny dropping moment, I think, because primarily what you're seeing is the element of lifelong learning now entering into the entire diaspora, especially in countries like India, Indonesia, and some of the other developing countries also outside of India. Most people get into jobs at a very early stage in life because of socioeconomic reasons. And I think now their ability to be able to go back every 3 to 4 years because of online education has brought a certain sense, again, of high level of awareness. So I think those have been the tectonic shifts overall. But the acceptability of faculty, acceptability of universities has brought about this change right now. And I think this is just the starting point.
Vikram, if I can lean into that from an Indian point of view. So in Cargill, we're having discussions that gradually we're going to shift from filling jobs in the locations where they have always been to filling jobs in the locations where the best talent is. And India has a really big advantage. India has an enormous amount of talent. Not just because of its sheer numbers, and there's all sorts of education problems. I was in India 6 months ago, and there's all sorts of problems in terms of educating people. But there's no question in our mind that India has a very large talent pool that is actually accessible for companies like us. So, people coming out of IIT, they do want to come and work for Cargill. We have over the last 5 years gone from 0 people in our shared service center in Bangalore to now 2,700 people. And we're finding that we have access to the finest professionals that you can find around the globe.
So Bikram, just to add to that, and I think in the last week, the government has also acknowledged the importance and the relevance of education, because the HRD ministry, what is called as the Human Resources Development Ministry, is now called the Education Ministry. So that's been again, a major change and a major focus in how important education is going to be. And I think the estimates are that expenditure of 4% of GDP towards education will now go to 6%.
I think that's something that's long overdue. That's one of the things that I'm going to come back and talk about. But let's go to Kamal, because he's smiling from ear to ear, because he's going to talk about technology. And technology is going to be the cornerstone. It's going to be the gear on which everything is going to move. So tell me a little bit about what you guys are planning and what's happening in the technology field, especially in healthcare, in education, and of course in agriculture.
Well, the reason I'm smiling honestly is because in all these 3 sectors, I guess the technology is making a huge impact. And for that matter, in fact, technology has become a backbone for any organization, any corporate to come out of this crisis. The fact that we are virtually talking itself is a factor which all enabled by technology. So let's step back and understand as to what has happened in the last 4 months in the corporates. I guess every corporate has got a very massive shift towards digitization, and that digitization is driving the entire focus and rewiring the entire business processes and the way they operate. Coming back to Marcel's point, it's not the people who are moving, it's actually the work which is now moving. So it's moved from offices to homes, and I'm sure it will start moving from countries to countries as well. So the fact still remains is that technology is going to lead the entire coming out of the crisis for most of the corporates, and it's seen everywhere. If you look at the organizations who have been successful in the last 4 months, who have kind of beaten the curve of decline, are the organizations who have anticipated and quickly responded to it. There are organizations who were very digitally savvy before the crisis, and they have actually come out far more, I would say, agile and active as of now. The rest of the organizations have to actually start seriously investing in the technology platforms. Now, whether it is education, whether it's agriculture, or whether it's healthcare, without investment in the technologies in either of the three sectors, I do not know how any corporate can excel. And there are hundreds of examples where technologies are being used, and I probably take agri as one of the examples. There has been a massive demand globally in terms of how the weather patterns have to be understood and used. And that is one big area where technology plays a huge role. And it is not a simple satellite imaging. It's about how the artificial intelligence goes in those imaging to understand how the weather patterns are changing and when is the right time to sow and what's the right time to reap. And that technology now in the current crisis has to go down to the masses. And that is where the real change would start appearing in. And that is what I guess we are on a cusp of a digital revolution in agri sector. There are organizations and there are individual farmers who are really taking the weather data and organizing their work based on the technology. And then all this now weather data and these recommendations to the farmers and to the producers is available on mobile at the tap of a button.
Now, since you monitor development patterns from across the globe, in your view, do you think that this pandemic can lead to a better development plan?
This is a great question, Bikramjit, but I think I'd like to set the stage here by looking a little bit about where we were at the end of 2019. I recognize it seems a lifetime ago now. We actually took stock in terms of the quality of our lives and the health of our planet back in September 2019 in the context of progress against the Sustainable Development Goals. And our findings at that point, supported by an international independent panel of scientists, were overwhelmingly indicating that we needed to do much better. So for example, progress in eradicating poverty and hunger was slowing, inequalities were rising in many cases and become more urgent, and there was a severe disruption of the balance between humans and nature. Of course, there were bright spots too. Economic growth was generating prosperity in many countries, life expectancies on average were rising, and access to the basics like energy and clean water was improving. And some quite spectacular gains were coming from poorer countries, but overall, a course correction was needed. So where exactly was this course correction going to be required? Broadly speaking, we were falling behind on two dimensions. First, improving the lives of those being left behind by the general rise in prosperity and incomes. And second, being able to address the trade-offs of growth with negative impacts on nature, evident in the accelerating pace of climate change and loss in biodiversity. And then, of course, along came COVID-19, millions infected, hundreds of thousands dead, billions of lives across the world thrown into turmoil and uncertainty, a terrible human tragedy. In a sense, though, the pandemic underscores some of what we were already seeing back then, and recent assessments bear us out. First, universal access to quality essential services like healthcare, social protection, clean water, energy, and broadband are themselves vital in enabling people to cope with the pandemic. The second point that this pandemic is underscoring is that human health and the health of the planet are closely intertwined. COVID-19 is just the latest in diseases that have jumped from animals to humans. But you and I both know that so many of these have happened in recent memory. SARS, MERS, Ebola, HIV. The list is long, and worryingly, it's increasingly close in time to us, just indicating how human activity is progressively encroaching on natural boundaries. And the third takeaway I think that the COVID is emphasizing is that in an increasingly interconnected world, not addressing these first two aspects, things that help people cope better, things that maintain the boundary between humans and nature, puts everyone everywhere at risk, not just from a disease, but from any other shock that can reverberate globally. Now, whether we proceed on an improved development path as we deal with the crisis will depend on whether we return to where we were, business as usual, or whether we leverage this moment as a turning point and we take actually advantage of the huge price everyone is paying for this to actually turn the tide along the three dimensions I mentioned. So there are a number of promising indicators here which show that all is not lost. If we actually play our hand well, we could emerge better. And let me mention just three. So the first is the unprecedented levels of fiscal spending that is happening in countries across the world, adding up to over 10 trillion now, I think, and probably going to increase in the future as well. So even after immediate humanitarian needs are taken care of, there is the potential for some of this to go towards establishing quality social protection, more sustainable infrastructure that will provide universal access to the essential services I mentioned, narrow the digital divide, and quite importantly, also generate stable long-term jobs. So this is one aspect. The second aspect is there have been a lot of underlying trends that are pushing us towards this scenario of a better outcome, but they need a nudge. So, for example, the falling cost of renewables for power generation makes them more than competitive to fossil fuels now. Remote delivery of quality services for education and health has been improving and been poised to accelerate, including through the application of AI. And economic factors themselves have been prompting a diversification of some manufacturing supply chains. So all of these are opportunities for business, and they're also opportunities for delivering better outcomes for people and for planet. And the final point I would like to make here, which is promising, is that just in coming to terms with and coping with the pandemic, we see the chance of a stronger political will for making the changes I've just spoken about. And with the right will, there can definitely be combinations of investments, technology deployment, and policy support, so that we don't return to our earlier development path, but instead transition to something that's truly transformative.
You know, one of the things that you were talking about, which is very important, which I want to ask all my panelists, and that is how much trickle down, how can we improve the trickle down to the majority of the country? Because when we're talking about agriculture and of course education, in a lot of places, it's very substandard. And even though, you know, Ronnie, you said that it's going to go up to 6%, I don't see how much of a big difference it's going to make at the ground level. But for us to really improve the state of the country and to be able to deal with a pandemic, God forbid if we ever have one like this again, is to have more people within this development and within this, you know, re-blooming of back to basics. So
I think on a trickle effect, I would say, you know, I think two things. I mean, part of this whole change in the education policy is also the trickle effect is now that you actually are an age group where it's only 6 to 14 where you had a right to education. And now that's been extended to 3 to 18 years. So I think that's more than a trickle effect. The other one example I can give you again in our not-for-profit, in our foundation, where we're working in rural India with about 1,200 schools, 800 Anganwadis. Last 4 months, the penny dropping moment for us has been that we've actually launched what we call Swadesh Digital, which is really, we've done a roadmap, and I know connectivity in villages is a problem, but almost 40% of our people can have access either to 4G, not necessarily broadband. So our ability to tell the farmer the importance of dairy, the importance of delivering your milk to a chilling plant 9 kilometers away, for actually school to carry on even a library lesson in a very engaging manner. Those are some of the connects, and those to me are the trickling effects right now, because those things will be permanent. Principals and teachers in rural India, if I'd ever gone and told them in education, for example, that, you know, we'll do this digitally, they would have thrown us the door, because that's not the convention. And now they're welcoming us. So then it's no longer a concept set later on.
Ronnie, if I had to add to that point, I guess the education and skill are very closely related, right? So if there is a focus on education, it is because we want to skill the people so that they can deliver, or probably they can, that's where they can deliver for themselves as well as for the masses and for the country. Now, if I look back the skill reports which are coming in from India for 2019, we have around 46% of our educated people are only able to be employed. Balance more than 50% people are not employable youth because of the quality of the education which they've got is not appropriate to make them employable. And that is where this digital revolution in education is going to help them. Because that way, as you rightly said, we'll be able to take the knowledge to the masses, and then we'll be able to give them the content and the, I would say, the learnings which they have been missing. And all this is a very acceptable norm now. So the entire skill building has to proceed with the education. And an education is now becoming more and more available for masses. And from masses, this entire skill will emerge. So that's a very important aspect. The other important aspect which I see is right now the technology would also, on one side would impact the masses and make it more available for masses. At the other end, it will also start helping people do personalized learnings and skill building. So we are seeing both the two extremes. As an individual, I can do very personalized learning, skill building, and I can also make sure that I'm kind of evaluated continuously on what my skill levels are. On the other end, where I need the masses to be educated, I'm able to do that. So that way, this entire crisis is going to lead on both the two extremes, masses as well as individuals.
So Marcel, I wanted to ask you a question. I know we've had a little chat about this before, about the business of agriculture, because most of agriculture in India is not in the formal sector, it's in the informal sector. What are you guys doing to push more agriculture into the formal sector, where it'll be more easy to predict? It's going to be it's going to be better for the farmers for sure.
We have in India an organization that is growing very rapidly. We're doing well. You know, we have more than $1 billion of revenue. We have decent profitability. Our businesses, some of our businesses deal with, you know, with lots of individual producers. For example, our animal nutrition and health business, you know, they will typically have, you know, hundreds of salespeople that go from one point to another. And help people become more effective breeders of animals. What was just said about the digitalization, I think, is highly pertinent in this environment. So, Kamal said the work has gone home to people, and that's not just for work. I think that's also for education. So, you know, reflect on the work has gone home. I called our shared service center, I think 4 months ago, and because, you know, the outbreak was raging in China, and I called them and said, Sumit, are we ready if we have an outbreak in India in our shared service center? He said, yep, Marcel, we already did a test with 1,000 people home for 2 or 3 days, and it worked fine. We had a very small loss of productivity, and you know, and this was long before the first cases started to come through. We've been able to close our global books without a single person coming to the office. You know, we close on the 31st of May. And one of the things that we found is these very big shared service centers that we now have out around the globe have helped us enormously. So this notion of work and education can move to where people are, I think is going to be highly relevant for us. We have, from an origination point of view, so buying grains from individual farmers always been relatively limited in India. We're a little further downstream. We tend to be a little further downstream, but we continue to be intrigued by, hey, is there a technological solution that would allow us to interact with more smallholder farmers rather than, you know, with aggregators? Because, you know, it's pretty clear that, you know, all the individual aggregators and wholesalers and whatever they may be called take a relatively significant amount of value out of the total value chain. And if you can actually bridge that gap with technology, then we would potentially help farmers to get better products or better prices for their markets. So the enablement of technology is going to play a role in that. We keep looking. We know that there are a number of Indian companies, small startups that are trying to enable that. So we keep looking at those. We keep looking as to whether or not we should go into that ourselves so that we would be able to address a lot more Indian smallholders than we currently are. We as an organization, we are not suited to to deal with 100 million farmers. It's not what we set up for. However, if there would be a technological solution, then that whole equation may shift. And the last thing that I would say around this technology solution, putting a handheld into people's hands, we know for sure that that's going to be, we all know, as we sit here, we all know for sure that that's going to become cheaper rather than more expensive. So I think it's a safe assumption to work from, or it's a safe bet to work from the assumption that, a couple of years from now, a handheld is going to be cheaper, broadband capabilities are going to be more ubiquitous, and therefore, that ability to push technology all the way out to individual smallholders is going to be strengthened, and that's certainly something that we are already playing in on the animal nutrition side, but it would be quite interesting to see whether we could play on that on the grain side.
Now, let me ask the panelist a question. It's like a little bit of a dirty word associated with, if you're in healthcare or if you're in agriculture or if you're in education, and which is the profit motive, because there is a question of being able to balance that with what you give to people. So how do you think it's going to change going ahead? Ronnie, what do you think is going to happen now? Will people be more aware? Will companies like yourself and other companies try and be able to balance out the need for profit with the need to provide a service which can help a lot more people?
So Vikram, I'm a first generation entrepreneur and I have very strong views on this. I think you are either for profit or you're not for profit. There is no such thing as for less profit. That's my personal view. And the reason I say that it's very relevant for a country like India is because do you want to solve a problem at scale? You will need to have profitability, because profitability will attract capital. Capital will attract scale. Scale will attract distribution. So actually, we're shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to say that, okay, just because I'm in the impact sector or I'm in the impact business, I need to make less profit. I think it's not a bad word, because if it solves a problem at scale, I'd rather have a hospital bed where everyone's charging at some sense of a market rate, where I can serve 1 million people, then I'm going to have subsidized beds for whatever else. The same applies in micro-housing finance, microfinance, and everywhere else. I think the question is, there are millions of people who can't get a loan. Do I want to attract and solve the problem for them? Or do I want to look at a rate arbitrage and not go above 11% interest or 9% interest to be able to solve the problem for 100,000 people? So I have a very strong view that not-for-profit does not necessarily mean you should keep your goals straight. If it's for not-for-profit, keep it there.
And do you think that education is going to be able to go forward even with...
I think if you want to solve problems at scale, you need to do that. If you need to solve problems at scale, you need to regurgitate. Profit, what is profit? It is actually profit that actually comes back into the system. 99% of the time it comes back into the system. Very rarely is it taken out in that context. Yes, very, very large companies may take a little bit of dividend, which is a reward to a shareholder for having invested in the company. But by and large, profitability is mostly goes back to reinvestment and attracting large capital.
Marcel, what are your views?
I'm just going to reinforce what Ronnie is saying. Here's a data point. I make a habit of interviewing everybody individually who comes into the strategy department. So, I interact a lot with young people who, have gone a bachelor's degree somewhere around the globe, then have actually been out there for a couple of years and then got their MBA. And I come across a lot of people who are looking for purpose in their work. And one of the reasons why they're attracted to Cargill is because they see that Cargill is a purpose-driven organization, but it is for profit. And they say typically what Ronnie just said. Yeah, I spent a couple of years in a not-for-profit organization, but I came to the conclusion that I'd like to have impact. If we can solve some of these problems and make money as we solve them, it'll attract a lot more capital. If you do something that is good for society and you make some money with it, hordes of people will start to copy what you are doing already, and it will hit scale in a real hurry. If you do something that is really good for society and you have to put money behind it, you're going to spend all of your days trying to find those hordes of money. Purpose, I do think that something has very fundamentally changed. So young people are all looking for purpose-driven organizations, and purpose and profit motive, I think, can go very well hand in hand. And the fact that everybody is looking for purpose in their work, that's great, because it drives very different behaviors from corporates, which I think is ultimately very, very good. So profit and scale tends to go hand in hand.
Kamal, what about scale when it comes to technology? Because, you know, it's 1.3 billion and counting, and we're only looking at one part of Asia. We're not even going into Indonesia and other parts where there's lots more to expand to.
First, the question on profit versus purpose. I guess as a corporate and as an IBM, as an organization, we are very clear that we are in the business for our stakeholders, and in that way, it's important for us to do a profitable business. But at the same time, being a large corporate, which is working across the globe, I guess it's our responsibility on the corporate social responsibility side as well, and we are doing a lot there. In fact, I would just take the current example of COVID crisis as to what we are doing as an organization. So IBM is leading a consortium or a formation of a COVID-19 high performance computing, as we call it, HPC consortium. Now, what is this HPC consortium? Is we are taking a vast amount of supercomputing capabilities or capacities that we have, putting it somewhere, we call it around 400 petaflops. It's a huge level of computing power. And we are making that entire power or the supercomputing power available to researchers to help them find a solution to the vaccination, as well as to the accelerate the discovery of vaccines. So that's a part of a social responsibility we are living up to. And coming back to India, we are offering the same, I would say, computes and same performance computing consortium coverage. And we are working with the IITs as well as NITs, and we are running some experiments here in India. For example, let's say for NIT Warangal, IBM is running an experiment to study the development of the structure or the dynamics of the virus on temperature and humidity. So that's a complete experiment being run. And similarly with our IBM research team, which is partnering with IIT Delhi to run an experiment on the supercomputers to study the effects of COVID on every cell in human life, in human body. So these are the few of the areas where we have supposed to, as a large corporate, we feel ourselves responsible to be part of. Now, coming back to the scale, the kind of a size of the country that we are, and an amount of deep masses, which are basically at the bottom of the pyramid, as I call that, technology has to make impact on everyone. Now, whether it's healthcare, take an example on the healthcare, the entire telemedicine, the way it is working out, it is going to open a new frontier in India. I mean, it will make the entire healthcare, primary healthcare, available to the masses. And it's going to turn the entire healthcare model upside down. So the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary healthcare would evolve from here on. And then the entire hub and spoke models would start is the next stage you will see. So this all is going to change because of the technology as well as the scale. Both are available for experimentation and deployment here in our country. What else probably needs to happen, something like agriculture or healthcare, is the investment from government. I guess I'm pretty clear that at least in healthcare, our government has to make the first move of setting up a digital healthcare platform. And I guess they are working on that direction. But that digital healthcare platform would form the basis on which this entire healthcare services to the masses using the digital world or using the digital technologies like blockchain and cloud computing, etc., would be able to be deployed. So masses are a means for technologies to scale up and then get the benefits down to them. So this is all correlated. You just can't pinpoint and say that because I have masses or I have a technology and I can do something. They're all correlated.
Now, this question is for Shantanu. When it comes to the three sectors which we have been discussing, agriculture, education, and health, how would you place them in order of importance and why?
It's actually hard to put one of these ahead of the others, but not just because they're all important, but I think they're all also interconnected in terms of how they help people realize their full potential. And so I think it helps to see them as parts of a bigger system. and consider how progress along any one of these has implications for other parts of the system too. And also to recognize that if there are changes taking place elsewhere, outside of these sectors, can they impact outcomes in these three that you just mentioned? So let me just give you a couple of examples. So when we are thinking of agriculture, we are thinking about what it produces, food and fiber and other crops. But we are also talking about livelihoods. We are talking about labor incomes. We are talking about nutrition. We are talking about natural resource use, and we are talking about environment. We are talking about apparent paradoxes. About 700 million are hungry, but also almost 40 million under the age of 5 are overweight. We are talking about apparent trade-offs. Agriculture sustains us, but it also produces over a quarter of the total greenhouse gas emissions globally, contributing to a looming climate catastrophe that can devastate us. The good news is that things actually don't need to continue in this way. Technologies exist for more sustainable farming methods and for averting food loss and waste. Awareness, advocacy, and policy can shift dietary preferences towards more balanced nutrition, less reliance on animal protein, and therefore a reduction in the carbon footprint of the sector. So some of the things I spoke about earlier, about the technological trends, about the increases in spending, about the opportunities for business to grow along these sustainable paths, can easily help agriculture itself deliver on its promise for better nutrition, better livelihoods, and less environmental impact. And if we look at health and education, of course, there are similarities in these sectors. I mean, in general, the pandemic has been a huge stress test for all countries. It's uncovering inadequacies everywhere and threatening gains that have already been made, for example, in reducing maternal and child mortality or in improving the quality of primary education. I think the pandemic has also brought to the fore how existing inequalities can compound each other and become more entrenched or turn up as inequalities in different kinds of outcomes. At the same time, we have to recognize that particularly in things like health and education, the pandemic has basically forced a giant global experiment and accelerated innovation. For example, all countries are in the midst of delivering learning through alternate models in the classroom, online, or some combination of both. Surely the lessons we will take away from this, and I do hope we can learn from each other, the lessons regarding the economic models, the social structures, and the individual attention that's needed will help develop more efficient, effective, and accessible platforms for education. We also have to ensure that the gains many countries have made in providing equitable and universal access is not reversed, and that education continues to deliver on its potential to reduce the transmission of inequalities across generations. In healthcare too, we see some of these things. Issues of universal access and quality are important. Based on trends till 2019, it was estimated by some experts that only about half the world's population, or maybe even less, would have proper health coverage by 2030. That's 10 years in the future. Hopefully, we will be able to address some of this through concrete policies and programs that are being put into place. And then we also have to look at quality, similar to education. About a quarter of health facilities across the world lack basic water services. Compared to 30 doctors per 1,000 that you have in higher income countries, a little less than half the countries in the world have 10 doctors or less per 1,000. That's a third of what's there elsewhere. Some of these can be addressed as countries turn to meeting the infrastructure gaps and scale up their spending that's already happening during the pandemic. Others through building up the cadre of healthcare professionals at all levels. It's not just doctors who are important, but other levels matter too. And yet others through innovations in providing lower cost solutions, as well as expanding access through digital technologies. So I think in all of these sectors, eventually we have to focus on transformations in a more integrated fashion. So we are looking to alleviate trade-offs and deliver co-benefits with other sectors. And we're also consciously working to ensure that no one is left behind so that we actually do get a transition pathway to a future that's more sustainable, more equitable, and offers better chances for the next generation than the current one does.
Okay. So now let me ask all my panelists the final question. And in this, let's do a little game. I'm saying take off your individual hats and become an expert in the field. From your heart, going forward, what do you think needs to be done? Marcel, say what you need to be done in agriculture across the globe. Ronnie, tell me what needs to be done in education across the globe. And of course, Kamal, tell me what needs to be done with technology supporting both. So I think, Ronnie, you can start.
Okay, I can start. Disruption is a very important part in what we're doing in this decade. And I think we need to question the constant. For me, non-linear thinking, especially in education, is really where we need to be. And for me, the basic assumption of non-linear thinking means the past is no longer relevant. B, we'll have to take huge risks. And C, if we do both of these, the rewards will be exponential and not mediocre. And I think if we can look at that in the education system, in the faculty system, in the governance, in the element of faculty, teacher training, in the K-12 sector, in the college sector, education is no longer an event. And I think for all of us, it was a life event that we went to school, then we went to college, and then boom, that was the end of it. It's no longer that. And I think for us, between the context of nonlinear thinking and lifelong learning, I see that as the two big disruptors that I would like to see. And that's what we are working very hard to at upGrad to disrupt on.
Okay. Marcel, what are your views?
Yeah, before I go to ag, we've just talked about profit and not for profit. I'm just going to throw in a pitch for my favorite Indian not-for-profit, Lotus Petal Foundation. I was in India, 6 months ago, as I just said. We went to a school which was founded by a very courageous gentleman who gave up a career in Nestle to found a school. So that's why I got all these notions around education. And education actually is a very big part of the future of agriculture. Obviously, if you have people who are more educated, they'll have access to better farming techniques, and they'll make a contribution to making their own individual enterprise more successful. The other thing that I would say is there are models in the world of successful agricultural development and models of less successful agricultural development. And there have been countries, of course, who've done very well, and they've created the right conditions for farmers to create an agricultural surplus, and creating an agricultural surplus is incredibly important to create the conditions for overall economic growth. And there's a number of countries who've done very, very well. I would say that we are, as an organization, intrigued and encouraged by the reforms that the Indian government is now announcing and is embarking on. That sounds to me like more price signals for farmers. That is a good thing. More infrastructure, that's a really good thing. More financing, that's a really good thing. And hopefully, if that all goes well, India will also make a journey from, at the moment, largely smallholder farms to some hybrid model, with lots of people still being smallholder farmers, but also some more scale appearing and professionalization. And then hopefully India can create a agricultural surplus. The rate at which India is growing, it will become a very big net deficit country. And that's not what the country should be. The country should be a net surplus country. And if you want to have a net surplus, then agricultural yields are going to have to go up a lot. I am always astonished by the difference between poor agricultural yields and better ones. That's not 10% different. No, that is a factor 10. So that gives you an idea as to how important it is to pursue successful models of professionalization in the agricultural sector. I think that's highly pertinent for India. If India wants to grow its economy and not become a massive deficit country from a food point of view, the reforms that the government have announced is a good step in the right direction.
Kamal, why don't you do a little summing up from the technology point of view? What is your dream? What if you take off your IBM hat and talk about technology globally and going forward?
I will take my ideal hat away, and I would just say that the corporates and the people are not doing enough. Now, if digital was impacted during the demonetization by a factor of X, I guess the COVID is going to impact by 4x or maybe 5x beyond. So corporates are not doing enough of adapting digital, and then they are at risk. And that's what I will just summarize that. They have to change their mindset for simple business continuity and operational efficiency to get into a growth mindset, which is led by technology. Unless we as people, we as corporates start working in that direction, I do not think that anybody can come out of this crisis easily, right? And the other part, I was just discussing with a first generation entrepreneur or retailer yesterday, and he told me very simply that this is an opportunity because it's a crisis. Crisis leads to opportunities, and those who are going to convert this crisis to opportunities are going to survive. So maybe that's the mantra for me and for everybody else I would like to share.
Well, thank you to all my panelists. I think the things that we can take away from this panel is the fact that profit motivation is very important. There has to be scalability. And of course, we have to be able to digitize and be more careful in the way that we spread the message. And of course, more people need to come into the purview of development, especially in these fields. Thank you very much, all of you, for being part of this panel and for taking the time out. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists once more for sharing their perspective. We encourage everyone in the audience to share their feedback on this session by leveraging social media using the hashtag #ETGlobalTownhall.